Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to Lesson 4, Process Costing System. In this lesson we're going to learn the fundamentals of a process costing system, including the flow of journal entries and T accounts. We're going to understand the calculation of equivalent units. We're going to prepare a weighted average production report, and we're going to learn how to prepare a FIFO production report. Okay, so everyone please have Lessons 4 cheat sheet in front of you. It's one page. So have that in front of you. We're going to start the concepts and definitions. We're going to start here at the top left. There's a flow chart, and it documents the differences between a job order costing system and a process costing system. Basically, they're very similar, but they're very similar in that they both take direct materials, direct labor, manufacturing, overhead. Those go into work in process, out to finished goods, and then to cost of goods sold. But the way they go into work in process for a process costing system, they go into work in process by process departments, and for a job order costing system, they go by jobs. That's the main difference. Is whether it goes whether you allocate to a processing department or a job. In lesson 2, in the job order costing system lesson, we had the job order costing documents, and we saw that the materials requisition form, the direct labor ticket, the job cost sheet. We attached those costs to a job number. Well, that's how we attach it. To a job in work in process, whereas in process costing, we just put it to a department. So how do we then allocate cost? Well, in order to allocate cost to units of production, we do it by preparing something that's called a production report. And the production report is from that we calculate the total cost and ending work in process, and then the cost used in production. So what's a production report? On the top right here, a production report is a summary of what occurred in the production process during a given period. There are 3 sections to the production report: a calculation of equivalent units, a calculation of cost per equivalent unit, and a cost reconciliation show all cost flows into and out of the department during the period. What's the equivalent unit? Back over here to the left, equivalent units are the product of the number of partially completed units and the percentage of completion of those units. Okay, what does that mean? Well, so the equation for cost per equivalent unit is cost for the period divided by equivalent units production for the period. And equivalent units are the product of the number of partially completed units and the percentage of completion of those units. So what's a process? One more definition: a processing department. Processing department is any location in an organization where materials, labor, or overhead are added to the product. The activities performed in a processing department are performed uniformly in all units of production. Furthermore, the output of a processing department must be homogeneous. Going back to lesson 1, we talked about job order costing system, process costing system, and how there was homogeneous units, or I think it was lesson 2 actually, not lesson 1. So lesson 2 we talked about production is for single units where they're not uniform. Process costing is used for where there's a lot of units that are the same. And that's basically what we're saying here in this process department definition. Okay, let's walk through an example of calculating equivalent units and preparing production reports. So go to the 1 down here in the middle, and where it says calculate equivalent units using the following information. Okay, so you're always going to be given certain information when you're trying to calculate equivalent units or prepare a production report, and you're going to be giving the beginning work in process and the percentage completion, the total units started, the units completed, and then the work in process at the end of the period. So the given information we have is work in process at September 1. You had 1,200 units in work in process. So of those 1,200 units, 35% of the materials were complete, and 25% of the conversion was complete. Remember, conversion is direct labor and overhead, and then materials is always just materials. So 35% of the material cost was already there, and 25% of the conversion cost was already there. It was that much complete. Units started into assembly in September. because this is a specific department, an assembly department. Units started into assembly in September, 7,400. Units completed and transferred to finishing department during September, 6,000. So we've got the assembly department, they put stuff together, and then they transfer it to the finishing department, and then they finish it, and then it's ready for sale, to be sold. And we're only looking at the assembly department because remember, process costing looks at cost by department, so that's what we're looking at right now, is the assembly department. Work in process at September 30th is 2,600 units. Of the 2,600 units, 50% of the materials cost was there, and 35% of the conversion cost was there. Okay, so that's the given information. Now we need to calculate equivalent units. And remember the definition, equivalent units are the product of the number of partially completed units and the percentage of completion of those units. So this table right now is what you're gonna need to calculate when you're given a problem. Units completed and transferred to the finishing department. Remember, that's a given. It's units completed and transferred. So we know those are whole units. Those aren't partial units or equivalent units. Those are whole units. They were completed and transferred. So how many whole units? How many completed units? 6,000. 6,000 completed whole units transferred out. Work in process. Now, remember, there's 2,600 units still in process, so not completed. And they were, and the cost of that was as such. 50% of the materials cost. So how do we come up with an equivalent unit? We take the number of units still in process times it by its percentage of completion. So 50% of 2,600 is 1,300. So we have 1,300 equivalent units of materials in work in process. And then conversion, we have 2,600 units at 35% complete. That's 910. So we have 910 equivalent units in work in process at the end of the period. So what's our equivalent units of production in the assembly department during September? We take the total whole units transferred out, 6,000, plus the partial units. But we've taken the partial units and gotten them into equivalent units. So instead of having 2,600 half-complete units, we can say that we have 1,300 fully complete units, right? Same with the 2,600 35%. Instead of saying we have 2,600 35% complete, how many of those would it be equivalent to completed? Well, if it's 35% complete, let's just take the 35% times the total number of those, and we can say that number of that cost, or those number of units, would be equal to the cost of 910 completed units. That's equivalent units. So we have during the period, the assembly department put into production 7,300 equivalent units of materials and 6,910 equivalent units of conversion. Now, so that's how we calculate the equivalent units. It's actually pretty simple. You just take as I said up here, the product of the number of partially completed units times the percentage completion. Now let's move into the weighted average production report. So we move to this red 2. Taking the information from the equivalent unit calculation example, which was above, prepare a weighted average production report for the assembly department. Assume that beginning work in process cost was equal to materials 15,600 and conversion 12,800. Further, assume that the following costs were added to production during September: materials 406,900 and conversion 304,300. Alright, so we're going to prepare a production report. Remember at the top right we said a production report consists of three things. The first is a calculation of equivalent units. So let's calculate equivalent units. Remember, so units to be accounted for. We got work in process, which was 1,200, and then started into production was 1,700. So that's our units to be accounted for. And then we've got our equivalent units calculation, which we've already done up here, but we're going to reconcile the units to be accounted for and the equivalent units. So we've got completed and transferred 6,000, and then work in process is 2,600. That 8,600 equals the work in process plus started into production. That reconciliation is important. But now we're going to say how many equivalent units? Well, 6,000 were completed, so that's a whole unit. That's 1 times 6,000, 6,000. And then we have in work in process, we have these partially completed units, and we're going to get an equivalent unit. So what's 2,600 half completed units equal to? Well, it's equal to 1,300 units. What's 2,600 35% completed units? Well, it's equal to 910 units. So that's our equivalent unit calculation right there. Now the second part of the production report is calculation of cost per equivalent unit. So let's take the total cost and then come up with cost for the period divided by the equivalent units of production for the period. That's how we come up with a cost per equivalent unit. So we're going to take it down here, weighted average production report step 2. We've got cost to be accounted for. 28,400 is our beginning work in process. That was in the given information under the red 2. We said